everybody, and welcome to Cartoon Clearance with Meg and Dan. I'm Meg,
And I'm Dan.
and we brought along some extra small Ramblepants for this episode.
Small enough to fit that of tiny little mouse legs. Because what did we watch yesterday? Not yesterday. What did we watch?
For this week's episode, we will be discussing The Secret of Nimh.
The Secret of Nimh.
The Secret of Nimh. So, Daniel, do you want to give a little background?
Of course. This movie was directed and really helmed by Don Bluth of Don Bluth fame. The story has it that Don Bluth and nine other Disney employees left in around 1979, I think, to create this movie, and slowly working up a budget, keeping it in the back of their minds for years, working out of Don Bluth's house. And eventually, I believe the movie was released in 1981 or 1982, I think. The film is based off a book, which I actually didn't know until recently. It was called Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nimh, which was written by Robert C. O'Brien, or O'Brien, however you want to pronounce that. The film is particularly noted. I think the reason why I picked it, besides being a childhood movie, like most of these movies are from my childhood, but was meticulously animated using more practical, older effects under Don Bluth's tutelage, favoring certain styles and whatnot. The film didn't make a lot of money in the box office, but I believe made a lot in the not straight to VHS, but VHS market, and has gained a considerable, not following, but
Yeah, to me it seems like it's become a pretty
it has pretty favorable
movie.
reviews. Although I will say I don't really know a lot of people my age. If I bring up, hey, do you remember The Secret of Nim? I don't think a lot of people remember it, but I do think it's remembered. The word is that there's actually a CG remake or some sort of sequel, regrettably, in the works. I'm a little upset about that. And there was a straight to VHS sequel about Mrs. Brisby, the main character of this movie's son, Timothy, which I remember more of than this movie initially. Meg, would you like to give a little summary of The Secret of Nim?
Sure. So, The Secret of Nimh is about a little widowed field mouse named Mrs. Brisby. The movie opens with a narration of how her husband, Jonathan Brisby, was killed in his freedom fighter efforts against the farm cat. So,
Yes.
Mrs. Brisby, she lives in I guess, a cinder block in a farmer's field, and all she wants to do is to keep her three children safe and happy. But this is complicated by the fact
Four
that
children,
her
actually.
Oh, yeah,
but you might
four.
as well not
I'm
even
sorry,
have the fourth one.
one of them is out of the picture so much that I just kind of forgot about him. But he's kind of the driving force
It
of
is.
the main
Yeah.
plot, considering that little Timmy gets pneumonia and is basically bedridden. But the farmer's plow will be coming to bulldoze them to death any day now. So Mrs. Brisby has to kind of go on this quest with the help of
Jeremy the Crow.
Jeremy the Crow, who is a bumbling character looking for love. She has to go seek the aid of a great wise owl and some rats in the thorn bush that have a very big secret.
A very big secret. So secret, in fact, that it was the name of the movie.
Yeah. So the deal with the rats is that they, along with her late husband, were the literal lab rats for experiments run by NIMH, which stands for the National Institute of Mental Health. And the experiments that were done on them granted them super intelligence. The rats now run a secret civilization in the thorn bush where they siphon electricity for their own technology. But they don't want to have to steal from the humans anymore, so they plan to move off to a place called Thorn Valley so they can become self-sufficient. There's a dastardly villain in the mix who doesn't want to move, so, he stages this coup against the rat's leader Nicodemus, which nearly leads to the casualties of the Brisby children as well. But Mrs. Brisby manages to save the day when her courage activates a magic amulet, and they all successfully manage to defeat the bad guy whose name is Jenner, and they move the Brisby home to a safe location. So, yay!
Yeah, that was not just a summary, but a very in-depth summary, I have to say.
Well,
Very good.
I wanted to get everything out of the way so that when we're discussing things,
That's true.
we
yeah.
already have a reference point for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand.
So, Daniel, do you want to what did you think of this movie? I know you watched it a lot as a child.
Yeah. Now, this is one of many interesting movies that I watched as a kid. The reason it's interesting being, I remember watching it all the time. and yet I remember almost nothing about it. So I kind of picked this both because it was, well, for a couple reasons. Don Bluth, I'm not really that into. I don't really know that much about Don Bluth movies. Actually, I won't say I don't know much about them, but I'm not as into them as some other animated movies of the same era. Great animation though, so that's another reason I want to watch it.
Oh,
It's like candy.
fantastic.
The voice actors, I know a lot of the voice actors in the film, and also I have no clue what happened in this movie. It's like a chapter of my life that I need a little bit of closure for. So I enjoyed it a good amount, and the closure was that I found out what the secret of Nimh was, which is really funny because it's in like the first 15 minutes. They say Nimh stands for National Institute of Mental Health, and I felt like I became I'm already an adult, but I felt like I became more of an adult.
Oh, really?
I'm like, oh my gosh,
That's what it is.
that's what the secret was, and I almost started to cry.
Aw.
Like, I can't believe it, but I really I enjoyed it. There, I think, are flaws in it that we'll talk about in depth a little bit later, but it was really good. I thought the voice acting was very well performed. The visuals, Don Bluth did a good job of his direction and his ideas, because there are time, like, the scenes are just very striking. The score is really good. Paul Williams, if anyone knows, music composers, I believe, does some of the music, particularly the ending theme. But it was really, like, I think you told me afterwards, it's very atmospheric, and
Oh,
I agree.
most
It's definitely. So what were your initial impressions just of the movie itself?
Well, definitely the first thing that got me was the atmosphere. The art and animation was fantastic. So I really definitely very much appreciated it on that sense. Like, as an animation fan, it was breathtaking.
Oh yeah.
I loved some of the character designs. I liked Mrs. Brisby as the main character. I think as a piece of artwork, it was absolutely gorgeous. But
Yeah.
as a movie, I had a lot of problems with it that would prevent me from saying this is a really good movie.
Yeah, giving a full recommendation
Yeah.
without consider, like, a movie like, I'm just gonna say Citizen Kane because that's the one everyone goes to. But people will be like, "Would you recommend Citizen Kane?" Most film people will be like, "Absolutely, you have to see it. There are no flaws in that movie. It's a perfect movie," which is a high bar to say. But when you're that enthusiastic that you're recommending movies to people, you should consider, okay, maybe this person wouldn't like this or that. So whereas I liked the movie. And I assume you liked it a little bit too. Like you said, I wouldn't give it a full recommendation.
Yeah.
I would have to be a certain person would be into it. I think also because the movie is somewhat dark, comparably much darker than I think most Disney movies of the time.
Oh, of course. There's no question of that. And I think that is a strength of the movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I definitely enjoyed the act of watching it. And I would probably do it again just because it's so pretty.
Yeah.
And like you said, it was like candy. It was beautiful to look at.
Were there any so you really liked a lot of the animation, and were there any scenes in particular? I know one in particular for me, but were there any scenes that really stood out to you as like, oh my gosh, this is amazing?
Yes. The great owl in particular. She went to see the great owl, and she has to get kind of pushed into going into his lair because, owls, mice. You know how that story usually ends.
And owl pellets, and in science
owl
class.
pellets, yeah. I love dissecting those, I gotta say. But anyway, that's another topic. Just the framing of that scene was incredible because she was, creeping through this really dark lair, and you first see the owl from its claws as it like crushes the spider that was trying to creep up on her, and everything was framed in a really nice way where you have this owl that's towering over her, and it just looks so aged. Movies like this always make liberal use of animal features and give them things that make them look a little bit more human. So like this owl had these massive bushy eyebrows and
a Fu Manchu.
Yeah, like this mustache, and it just made him look so aged and wizened and old, and he was just covered with cobwebs on his wings, which was a beautiful touch, I thought. And he had these massive glowing eyes, a very, very strong resemblance to the Rats leader Nicodemus.
Yeah.
Which was intentional on the part of Don Bluth, I read.
Yeah.
I like that everything was very tailored to like the mouse's perspective. You had the farm cat who was terrifying.
Yeah. Or even the rats in scale to the mice.
Yeah, definitely.
Like, the rats were much taller than Mrs. Brisby and the rest of the mice. I just thought, like, in another, maybe not in another movie, but someone who wasn't paying attention, you'd be like, rats, mice, what's the difference? You just make them
Right.
the same size. But no, there's like a visible difference.
Yeah.
Both because most of those guys, I believe, wear pants. For me, I think my favorite scene in the movie is, and I think you'd agree, that's a great scene, when the plow finally comes. I won't say finally, but in the scene before, like, a character says the plow's coming, you guys gotta move, and Mrs. Brisby's like, I can't, Timmy's sick, and she's like, oh, I warned you guys, it's gonna come any day now. There's this scene where they're just kind of hanging out in the morning, and then they hear the plow, and it's like pure anarchy and chaos, and like all the animals are freaking out. The plow is lurching forward slowly, animals are running through the plain, warning each other, they're running away, and I'm usually not a huge fan of rotoscope animation because it never really just... I like what you could do. You animate over like a regular film, which is, I believe, just the simplified version of what rotoscope is for anyone out there that doesn't know.
Yes.
But it usually, like, I could still see the, whatever you want to call it, the film behind it, and it just kind of looked like someone traced over it as best they could.
Yeah, it was pretty obvious rotoscope.
When the plow, and yeah, it looked like it was a real thing. But when the plow was coming out, and it was rotoscoped, and there was an actual man sitting on top, and they just looked like monsters. Like, it was so unnerving. And it was, oh my gosh, it was really, really awesome scene. And that's sort of what I think is one of the biggest strengths of this movie, is that Don Bluth was like, all right, what can we do to make this particular effect or whatever thing would be going on in the movie extra strong? Like, one of the characters, Nicodemus, is sort of like a wizard. So he has this scene where he's like siphoning ink magic out of an inkwell, and he's like swirling it around. Or even his eyes, and the Great Owl's eyes, they light up. They actually cast like a glow, and you think like, oh, how'd they do that? And I read Don Bluth like shone a light through those animation cells and animated over it, so when they filmed it, they actually filmed the light passing, so that's why it looks like actual light, because it is actual light.
And that's pretty impressive.
It's so cool. And for me, I'm in an age in my life where I really, if anyone out there doesn't know, because we haven't really talked about CG movies that much, but I'm not a huge fan of the computer-generated era that we're in.
Neither am I.
Not because I don't think that they're all bad, but it's not the same to me. And particularly when you get to like visual effects in live-action movies, it just doesn't look good to me. I don't like it. I prefer, they call me old-fashioned. But this movie was like a nice refresher. Like, it was back in 1980, so it's not like a refresher. But a lot of the decisions, even though they were really hard and maybe cost a little bit more money, they're like, no, we gotta do it because I want it to look good. And it did. So, Mr. Bluth, if you're out there,
good job.
Thank you, good job. Let's get to talking about some of the characters in the movie. So you have Mrs. Brisby, who was originally Mrs. Frisbee in the book, but they changed for a copyright reason, even though I think Frisbee was spelled differently. Whatever.
Yeah, well,
you got to be careful when you're making movies of these kind of things. Mrs. Brisby, I really like as a character. There's a couple things I think within the movie that I found to be a little like not a nuisance, but bothersome. But overall, I thought she was a great character, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. I loved how she just kept pushing forward, no matter how scared and timid and mouse-like she was.
Oh yeah, she had moments of major doubt all the time, like when she's talking to Auntie Shrew, who we'll get to next, and she's like, I wish Jonathan, my husband, was here right now. And she was like, well, he's not, so get over it. And she's like, I know, I'm sorry. And like, I'm like, that. It's like, it's funny to say that mouse was really human.
But that's what you want in a movie that you're trying to make humans identify with.
Yeah, exactly. Although, I mean, maybe you made a movie for a mouse. Who knows?
Maybe. Well, if we ever get opinions from some mice on Secret of Nimh, we'll let you know.
But yeah, Mrs. Brisby, even though she was horribly shaken, put off, had doubts, was afraid, she was like, I gotta do it because I have my kids. I gotta do it because I want to find out such and such.
Yep.
I could die, but I have to do this. And she was really like the best. I mean, she's the main character of the film, so she is the best character.
I really liked her. I thought that was a really good choice to make her the main character.
Yeah. On the contrast, Jeremy is a poopy doopy character, I think, but maybe you can, give some perspective on this.
He's the comic relief character, and
Yeah.
while I do think that that's a nice, I guess, change of pace from some of the other scenes where it's really dark and you're worrying about whether your small child is going to die or whether all of your children are going to die or this or that or the other thing, he lightens the mood a little bit. However, he's kind of stopped having any relevance to the actual plot after I think his second scene when he
Yeah.
flew Mrs. Brisby to see the Great Owl. You know, it was really sweet the first time they met because, you know, she kind of helped him get unstuck from a big tangle of string, and then they were ambushed by the cat, whose name is Dragon. And she loses the medicine for Timmy in the water, and she's crying afterwards because, you know,
She
her
pretty
kid
much,
is
yeah,
gonna
her son is
die.
gonna die.
And Jeremy the Crow is kind of bumbling around like, oh man, did you see that? That was awesome. I was so cool, weren't you? Oh, and you were really cool too. And she's like, it doesn't matter. Like, I dropped the medicine. And he's like, oh, by the way, you dropped this piece of paper and it's the medicine. And she just, like, that was really sweet.
He didn't even. Well, the other thing is he didn't realize it was the medicine. He's like, "Oh man, the medicine! I'm so sorry. Oh, by the way, you dropped this paper, but your medicine. Oh man, like we gotta find that." Sincerity in a comic relief character.
He cared enough about this random stranger to pick up something that she dropped. He like threw
To him,
himself
that was a
into
piece of
harm's
paper.
way. Yeah, he threw himself into harm's way to fend off the cat a little longer so she could get away. It was sweet. And then the next time he shows up, he flies her to the Great Owl, and then after that, he's just pure comic relief. He doesn't even show up in like the climactic scene of the movie. She had kind of sent him off to go get string, and he didn't show up again until the very end of the movie after everything was already finished. So I was kind of let down a little bit with that because I'm sure he could have been found a role in that climax.
Yeah, and the thing is, he's introduced quickly after Mrs. Brisby gets the medicine, and that only takes a couple minutes. So you sort of, and the camera, not the camera, but the film takes a lot of time to establish that, oh, this guy, you're going to see him a lot probably because I'm giving him a lot of attention now. You would have hoped that he would have had an arc, because he doesn't really. His motivation or his goal is he's collecting bits of string and yarn because he wants to attract a mate, but he's too clumsy, and girls don't like that. And, every once in a while, he'll be like, Mrs. Brisby, like, what do you think I should do to attract? What's your advice? And she'd be like, maybe you should be, like, athletic. Or, and he'd be like, all right. And then he'd, like, puff up his feathers and, like, fall into the lake or something.
Yeah.
And he'd be like, oh, ha, 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 he fell down. But and, like, he'll come back and he'll still be like, I still haven't gotten a mate. You got any, like, advice? Or, oh, what you doing? And, like you said, after he takes Mrs. Brisby to the Great Owl, he stops mattering. Like, there's a scene where he still wants to help out. And it's kind of cute and, like you said, sincere. That this guy, even though he has no clue what's going on, he's like, I want to help out.
Yeah.
How can I help out? And she's like, go watch my kids.
First of all,
like,
I
yeah,
don't know.
okay.
I don't know why you would trust your kids to that crow who can barely stand on his own 2 feet.
This is what the part of the review where we start getting into the inconsistencies and possible what we called like almost closed circles.
Yeah.
They're not quite closed, so they don't make a lot of sense when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, the character Jeremy gets to the point where even the main character is using cheap tricks to get him to go away and leave her alone.
Yeah. And by cheap tricks, we mean batting her eyes and putting her hands on her cheeks.
But, she goes to send him off to go watch her kids, and she's like, by the way, make sure you don't tell them where I am, which is movie speak for this character is totally going to tell them where she is, and they're going to go trying to find her, and there's going to be trouble. So
yeah.
he goes, and you next see him getting tied up by Auntie Shrew, who doesn't trust him. And, the kids find him, and they're like, where's Mom? Where's Mom? And so he tells them where their mom is, and they're like, okay, we're going to go get her. And then he's like, nope, you can't do that. You can't do that. And, they think he's crazy. And then I guess the kids forget about going to get their mom because the next scene we see them in, they're just kind of hanging out at home with Auntie Shrew. And it's kind of, well, what was the point of that scene then?
Well, first of all, it's like, where did you guys go? Because they said they're in the rose bush. It's like, okay, we gotta go to the rose bush. Because they said that, I assume they know where that is. But then they just don't, and there's no scene of that. And, like, I'd say this really is the start to a lot of, like, my problems and inconsistencies that I started realizing in the movie. Like, why Mrs. Brisby, like you said, would be like, Jeremy, go watch my kids. I just said that to get him away from me. It's like, yeah, and then you mentioned, well, wouldn't she be afraid that he'd probably, like, eat the kids by accident or something stupid because he's an idiot? And I'm like, oh, well, she probably was like, he doesn't even know where I live, and Auntie Shrew might tie him up. But that's assumption. And this is a good example, I think, of you should never write or create something with the intent of being like, well, they'll figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
They'll assume such and such. Because the possibilities are endless. What if all the kids went to White Castle? I don't know. I mean, they might why not? Because they didn't go to the Rose Bush like I thought they were.
Yeah.
And this might seem like a nitpick, but it goes on more because then you realize later on, Miss Brisby goes into the Rose Bush. She meets these people who like, oh, you're Jonathan Brisby's husband. You're Jonathan Brisby's wife. That would have been amazing if she was her husband.
Very progressive
like,
for the time.
This Jonathan Brisby was the reason we escaped the National Institute of Mental Health. Like, he was a huge mover. He died protecting us. Like, he tried to drug Dragon. Like, oh wow, Jonathan Brisby's a cool guy. Wait a minute. Why did he not move into the Rose Bush and bring his family with them instead of leaving them out in the middle of a cinder block field?
Because it was
where a
secret.
plow could run them over. Because, yeah, it was a secret. Or why did Jonathan Brisby never tell his wife that the medicine would make him age less so she would die before he did? And she would be super old and he'd look like he was still a kid.
Not to mention the children that they had together who would presumably also have some of this affect them as well.
You know what this is? I mean, I've been reading The Green Mile recently. This is like the reverse of Mr. Jingles. If Mr. Jingles' story went on after he left the mile.
Yeah. Maybe Jonathan Brisby is Mr. Jingles.
You mean Steamboat Willie?
Steamboat Willie.
The very same. I'm sorry for anyone who might be spoiled by The Green Mile. Anyway, but there's a lot of sort of almost closure moments, but they don't quite reach it. And it's only when you stop to think about it. So at least it's not overt, like Mrs. Brisby's like, I gotta get Timmy medicine, and then there's no scene of her giving Timmy medicine. Like, that would have been, unacceptable. These are scenes where it's like, how come they didn't resolve this?
There's a lot of those things that I had a problem with watching this movie, even just the first time. Nothing really felt resolved in a way that was satisfactory to me. So,
yeah.
First of all, you have all of these things that are introduced as being important plot points for various characters. So you have the rats want to move to Thorn Valley. What's Thorn Valley? What's so special about it? Why there and not the fields next to the farmer's pasture? Nothing is ever described about Thorn Valley. And obviously, there's a limited time for these things. But still, even just a line that gives some indication of what's so special about Thorn Valley.
Or what's their fascination with thorns? They live in a rose bush engulfed in thorns. Or even there's a character who's the villain named Jenner. Why is he a villain? I need to know a little bit of motivation. And really, his only reason for eventually, spoiler alert, pretty much straight up murdering Nicodemus is I don't want to leave. I want to leave the thorn bush. There's an interesting philosophical debate discussed among the rats, which I actually liked, where Jenner's Nicodemus is a fool. He's trying to lead us astray. We can stay here and siphon off energy from the humans as long as we want to. They did this to us. It's their thing. And there's another side that's saying no, we can't go on stealing. Stealing's wrong.
We're self-aware now.
We're self-aware. We're better than this. We're still rats if we steal. I'm oh, you know what? This is really interesting. But that's not the motivation to stay in the thorn bush necessarily. That's just a philosophical argument. Jenner's evil for no reason. And I thought everyone talks about Jonathan Brisby all throughout this movie. Oh, you're Mrs. Jonathan Brisby? Not once is anyone you'd think somebody would be jealous of Jonathan, or maybe envious of him.
Maybe that could have been Jenner.
Maybe Jenner wanted to be the one to help everyone get out, but Jonathan did. Or maybe they did it together, but Jonathan got all the credit or something. Just little things that if it was set up a little better would have explained. Now he wants to murder Nicodemus and bury Mrs. Brisby's house in a cement block in the mud. And then, Mrs. Brisby later on comes, and she's like, the humans just called Nimh. I just heard them. They're going to rip up the rose bush. And then everyone's like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. I have no reason to not believe Mrs. Brisby, except one character, and that's Jenner, who's shut up, and he, slaps her across the face. And then sees that she has an amulet, and this is another thing we'll talk about.
Yes.
The amulet, and then he wants to, murder her. And there's this, there's an amulet in the movie that Nicodemus holds. And it looks like he's divining Jonathan when he because he speaks into it. He's oh, Jonathan, your wife is coming here soon, and blah blah blah. And then eventually he gives Mrs. Brisby this amulet. Okay, that's cool. And then there's a scene where Jeremy's oh, you got a shiny? Can I have it? And they asks her a couple like times later on. It's like, okay, there's some weird lust for this like amulet. And then Jenner sees the amulet, is like, I want that.
And just starts trying to
But
kill her in front of everybody.
the problem, like for Jeremy a crow, I could understand because crows are no, they're actually crow. I was about to say crows are stupid.
No,
Crows are not
very,
stupid. I take
definitely
that
not.
back. But a lot of birds like shiny objects, so I thought it was like fitting that he was like, ooh, a shiny. Can I have it? Can I borrow that? But Jenner, like just seeing an amulet for the first time, I assume because I've never seen him look at it before, or there's no mention that Jenner really liked this amulet. He just wants it because.
Yeah, really, the only hint that we got about the amulet was Nicodemus making some vague statement about how it would be bad for certain people, aka Jenner, to get a hold of power as he's like looking at the amulet. And so maybe Jenner knew about the amulet beforehand, but who even knows? Because really the amulet only seems to activate when you have courage of the heart.
And the amulet is magical and helps Mrs. Brisby levitate or bring the cinder block back out of the muck. It's funny because it only brings it back out, and then I guess the rats push it to the other side of the stone, like they're like the amulet doesn't like fling the house over.
I would hope not.
Which I guess is good because the kids
were
were in it. But then again, they left the kids in there the first time.
Yeah.
And I think when you brought it up, my favorite scene now is when the house is flooding with mud, and the kids are like, "Hold on, we gotta get on the table. The house is flooding," and they almost suffocate. And I was like, "Hey, what about Timmy?" No one says, what about Timmy?
One of them does say, like, what about Timmy? We need to help. But, like, no one ever actually gets up to do anything about it. And Timmy, who's in bed in the other room, has probably drowned by now. Not to mention Auntie Shrew, who was just, like, passed out on the floor, and we don't really see her in the shot.
Yeah.
But this kind of brings me back around to the things that weren't really cleaned up nicely. So you had the magic amulet, which, while that scene where she, like, used it to telepathically lift the house out of the mud was beautiful to look at and really moving in, like, an emotional way.
Because, like, it, like, sparks with fire, and she touches it, and she, like, brings her hands back, and, like, understands, once again, a real Mrs. Brisby thing. I'm afraid to touch this, but I gotta, so she does.
But there wasn't really any build up to the amulet aside from, like, power of courage, yeah, and also, like, how does gaining intelligence lead to magic powers? Because Nicodemus very definitely has magic powers.
Yeah, he's a wizard. He's a wizard.
He's basically a wizard. I think it needed to be built up more than just with a couple of lines that vaguely foreshadowed it.
Yeah.
You had the fact that nobody seemed to care or make any mention of the fact that they left the children inside the house as they were physically lifting it to a pretty substantial height up in the air to move it to a different place.
They live in a cinder block. That's dangerous.
And there were a lot of other things that were kind of brought up and then not really resolved. So, for example, you had the farmer's cat Dragon, which I felt like it had kind of a false build-up as an antagonist because...
Introduced as a pretty big antagonist pretty much throughout
everyone
the whole
is
thing.
Terrified of Dragon. And then there wasn't really, like, a climactic scene where anyone was facing off with him. There was that one scene in the beginning.
In the very beginning.
Mrs. Brisby and Jeremy escaped from him. But I was expecting him to come back and be, like, a major threat. And at one point, Mrs. Brisby offers to take on the role of drugging the cat so that he's, you know, sleepy and the rats can move around without problem. So she runs and she goes and she drugs it as he's, like, getting let into the house. And I'm like, okay, here's where this scene is going to come. But no, then one of the farmer's kids catches her under, like, a colander and is like, hey, I found a mouse, can I keep it? And so she gets put in a cage, and Dragon pretty much doesn't have a role again.
Well, Mrs. Brisby does bump into him.
But that doesn't really count. He just goes back to sleep. You also have this dashing young rat named Justin who's introduced, and there's definitely a flirtation between him and Mrs. Brisby. They definitely are kind of making eyes at each other. And while I can't say I'm disappointed that never came to anything, because I think with the amount of time that they had, any attempt at romantic development would have just been a disaster.
Yeah. But they still set it up. They set something up.
But the fact is that they still set it up, and I was expecting to at least see some kind of lead-in for a potential there, like them having an exchange of words at the end, like, oh yeah, we're friends now, like maybe we'll visit each other. But no, because at the end of the movie, after she moves the house, all of the rats are just gone to Thorn Valley. She's just kind of sitting there with her kids, and, you know, we never see the rats moving, we never see any parting words. It feels really empty and really abruptly cut off. And, you know, I was also hoping that we would maybe learn Mrs. Brisby's her personal name through interaction with Justin, because she was just referred to as Mrs. Brisby or Mrs. Jonathan Brisby the whole time.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was disappointed that she never got to kind of establish her own identity via her own name, because she
Yeah.
more than lived up to her own identity by taking her own
Exactly.
action over the course of the movie.
I like that she was like her name was Mrs. Brisby because I thought, oh, she doesn't have an identity. She lives in the shadow of Jonathan, both to the rats, both in her own life where she wishes that Jonathan was still there. To her, I wouldn't say to her kids because there's no real scene of like I wish Dad was here, but
she very much
she lives in the shadow
that.
of doubt. Her like for the existence of this movie. But like you said, and maybe that's like the whole thing. It's like, but she's better than Mrs. Brisby. But it just would have further put that thing home if it turned out she did have a name, or she did have a name from the beginning, but everyone just chose to call her Mrs. Brisby the whole time. And then finally, at like one point, she's like, "You don't have to call me Mrs. Brisby. You can call me blah blah blah."
Yeah.
Like, and I thought, like, well, this rat was was a rat, or this mouse was living before she met Jonathan. Did she just not have a name? I guess not.
Which is kind of a shame to me.
Yeah, it's like, but it's like that's like an almost complete circle because I still like everything that happened. But if they just completed that one thing, I think it would have been much better just to have a fully rounded character arc. Because Mrs. Brisby certainly has an arc.
Of course she does.
Although I wouldn't say it's overt because like her whole thing is like an internalized doubt. It's showed outwardly, but it's all internal. And at the end of the movie, she's just getting her hands bandaged up by her kids. But you assume everything she's gone through, she's probably a lot more wise and a lot more comfortable because her house has moved and she seems cool with things.
Yeah. Oh, she saved her kids.
Jeremy, on the other hand, has no arc, but is rewarded with a clumsy female crow.
Literally out of the blue.
It's like another thing where Jeremy comes back and is like, what do I do? Like, how do I impress her? And Mrs. Brisby's like, be athletic, which is what she told him earlier in the movie. He's like, right. It's like, why didn't Mrs. Brisby just say, like, why don't you be yourself?
I was expecting a line like that, too, actually.
Yeah, the aha moment of being like, oh. Because the thing is, like, they introduced Jeremy and Mrs. Brisby pretty close together. And they both, well, Jeremy shows up in a lot of scenes with Mrs. Brisby. And you assume they're going to either learn stuff from each other or they're going to grow together. One person's struggles parallel another person's struggles. Jeremy's looking for a wife. Mrs. Brisby has just lost her husband. Like, you get some, like, sort of parallels, but not.
Yeah, I was not all too impressed.
Yeah, and in conclusion, I think, because I think we've talked about this movie for a pretty long time.
Yeah.
I think we've hit on most of our points. I'd say if you want to watch this movie, absolutely do it. Don't watch any movie. You can watch whatever movie you want to. But I'd say the big things to look out for is the atmosphere that's accomplished through both a combination of the actors, the music, and the animation. Those three things are super strong, even if some of the things going on aren't really developed enough, in our opinion at least.
Mm-hmm.
It's still, I think, like you said, it's enjoyable to watch. Like, the act of watching it is fun. And I was really swept up in the whole moment, personally.
Oh yeah, like I definitely felt for Mrs. Brisby. I was moved by her story, and yeah. I did really enjoy that. So I wouldn't necessarily not recommend this movie. It has flaws. It definitely has flaws, but it's still, I still found it worth watching because it was beautiful to look at. And it was enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think it's in a positive range, but I think the highest I would give it would be 80 to 85 because it's not fully, and I think that's being a little generous, but I like the movie. I can sort of forgive the flaws because of what else it accomplishes.
Mm-hmm.
And what it accomplishes, it does really well. And what it fails in, it's just lacking just that extra push to bring it up.
Yeah, but I still felt really kind of let down.
Disappointed. Yeah,
by
I understand
the fact that so much was just left hanging.
Yeah.
So no, I would probably give it like I would give it a 100 for animation and artwork, and like
I'd say 6
50
as far
or 60
as development glow
for story.
Yeah. It's definitely a 6 out of 10 sort of as far as development, because a lot of things are left underdeveloped or just don't conclude in
Yeah.
a satisfactory way.
Yeah.
But I think like I said, what it achieves, it does really well. So
Yes, I would agree.
I think I would definitely recommend it. It just depends on the kind of person.
It depends on whether you prioritize the artwork or having a
Yeah.
fully rounded story.
Yeah, and the other thing is too that the movie is particularly dark, much darker than your run-of-the-mill Disney movies. In Disney movies in general, Disney movies can sometimes be dark, like in Snow White, a
Hunchback
lady
of Notre
dies.
Dame.
Hunchback of Notre Dame is probably pretty dark in its darkness. A lady dies in the first 5 minutes to the tune of some jester's song, but but this movie is like it's a dark movie all the way through. There's no like topsy turvy day. It's
Yeah.
like there's a scene where Mrs. Brisby is spoon feeding her dying son while her other son is feeling guilty for being a bad kid. It's like, oh man, it's an experience. But if you're the kind of person, if you know a kind of person who can handle that, do it. As far as children, I watched it when I was a children, and I couldn't remember much of it. I think it was because I'd rather watch other movies though. But I liked it as a kid, and I like it now.
I never watched it as a kid, but I enjoyed it enough now.
Yes. So that's gonna wrap it up for this week's episode. Thank you everyone for listening. It's been a wild ride. If you like what we're doing, or you think we left something out, leave a comment or a like. It would help us out. Or subscribe even. We would be much obliged.
Yes, we would.
That's it for this episode. We are the Discount Ramblepants.
And remember, if you're going to feather a nest, you've got a lot to learn about how to treat a lady.
Goodbye.
See ya!